Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club. I'm Millicent. I'm the programme editor here at the club. Tonight's discussion on aid agencies and their relationship with journalists. We're holding it in association with the European Interagency Security Forum. So thank you to them, and Lisa will talk a little bit more about the work that they do. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Ben Parker, who's worked in this field for a considerable amount of time and is the co-founder and CEO of IRIN, which I'm sure a lot of you know about. So before I hand over to Ben, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live, and if you're using Twitter, we'll be using hashtag Frontline Club this evening. So over to Ben.
Thank you very much, Millicent. Thanks everybody for coming. You're very welcome, and we've got a great panel for you this evening, and I think a subject which a lot of you will have plenty to say on, so we're going to turn it over to you in the audience pretty early on. Thinking of strange embedding stories of my own, I think the strangest one I ever had to do was take a dressage horse rider around South Sudan on behalf of UNICEF. I tried to get her to ride a donkey, but she wouldn't do it. So, without further ado, this is a subject which I think perhaps those of you who are journalists in the audience will see the tension point of view, but also perhaps in a journalist-dominated club, you may also be interested to hear how the NGOs see those dilemmas as well through a different lens from the other side of the fence. So I'm going to ask I should introduce everybody, but I'll start with Polly at the end. Polly Makandia is the head of communications for Médecins Sans Frontières. Fairly busy job this year especially. Lisa Riley is the executive coordinator of the EISF, which Millicent introduced. Siobhan Sinnerton is the commissioning editor for news and current affairs at Channel 4. And Michelle, who's asked to kick things off, Michelle Betts is a former journalist who now does media development with the UN and NGOs in conflict and other post-conflict countries. So Michelle, I think, will try and set the scene for us, and then we'll go around the panel once and then take it out to your thoughts and comments and questions. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Ben. I'm really happy to be here. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about some of my impressions, which essentially come from my background, both as a journalist, but primarily from my work in media development, so working with journalists and media sectors in conflict and post-conflict countries, such as South Sudan, Central African Republic, the DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, et cetera, et cetera. I suppose my claim to fame really is the fact that because of work I did for an NGO, not as a journalist, but as a program manager, I was sentenced by Egypt to 5 years hard labor. So Egypt is not a country I'll be going back to anytime soon. So I guess that, in a sense, is just a kind of aside, just to let you know that, it's not just journalists, such as the Al Jazeera journalists, who countries go after, but also NGO workers as well. I think what's really interesting about journalists embedding, which I think is probably a bit of a strong term. When we use the term embed, we really think about the military, and NGOs really aren't very militaristic. But I think, that if you can call it a ride-along, a tag-along, whatever you will, but essentially what we're talking about tonight is what does it mean for journalists to embed, to ride along with NGOs? Essentially what you've got on the one hand, you've got those who are trying to report the story, and on the other hand, you've got NGOs, organizations such as MSF that are really trying to solve certain problems. So there is a certain mutual need, I suppose, but on a certain level, there is, or perhaps there should be, a certain level of mutual mistrust and a certain kind of questioning of what each of those sides needs. what we've got today, really, we've got, because of all kinds of economic pressures, both in the donor community, but also in the news media, you've really got kind of these two groups working closer and closer together. On the one hand, you've got in the news media, you've got economic pressures, which means foreign bureaus are shutting down, which means it's more difficult, if not impossible, sometimes for correspondents to go into the field to cover the stories that need to be covered, which also then results in younger and younger, particularly freelancers, going into the field to cover these stories. They're looking for ways to cover the stories, and so they'll often approach NGOs to do tag-alongs, ride-alongs, to embed with them. On the flip side, you've got the NGOs also, and that community is mushrooming like we've never seen before. There are so many, millions and millions of NGOs, I mean, I don't know how many there are, but there are local NGOs, international NGOs. The bottom line here is that they're all competing for donor money. The aid, I would argue that the aid business really is big business, just as journalism is a business. So there are kind of competing economic interests here as well, which I think is really, really important. Just going to leave it with a couple other thoughts, and that is, I think journalists face a number of challenges when they go to some of these post-conflict humanitarian zones. All kinds of issues such as logistics and safety are often, if they do embeds, they're often left to the NGOs to take care of those things. In some cases, the journalist is expecting the NGOs to provide transport, to provide security for them. And I think this is where we can get ourselves, both journalists and NGOs, where we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble. It leaves people open and organizations open to all kinds of liability issues, safety issues, and that kind of thing. I think I'll leave it there. I've got a few more points to say, but I'm sure they'll come up during the questions. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Michelle, for setting the scene. Lisa, with a security point of view, how does it look to you?
Thank you. Just to say, I come from a very different background to the other panellists. I work for the organisation Millicent mentioned, the European Interagency Security Forum, which looks at staff safety and security for NGOs to enable us to be able to implement the programme. So different perspective. And following on from Michelle's point about when journalists arrive, who is responsible for the security? Within NGOs, we don't have a consistent view. We often see gaps between the comms department and the rest of operations and programmes in the first place, never mind by the time you add the journalist and their objectives as well. Michelle mentioned embedding or tag-along. We tend to think that there are sort of three sorts of ways that we tend to work with journalists as NGOs. One would be where we're actually employing a journalist as a consultant. So there's a specific message, there's a specific project that the journalist has been employed for. We may be hosting the journalist, providing accommodation, perhaps providing transport, providing access to the programmes, to areas where we're working. Or it might be much more tag-along in terms of we may just facilitate access. And each of those have their own problems and issues as far as security is concerned. Who is responsible? Where does the duty of care lie? We may, from a legal perspective, think it's easier for us in the consultant position, because then we have a contract, we can state these are our rules, these are our security policies, you must follow them. But then what happens if the journalist stays in country for 3 or 4 days after they've done your project? Who's responsible for their security at that point? And as we get a more and looser relationship, that duty of care becomes very blurred. we may not have a contract, but the journalist is using the vehicle. So what happens when you get to a situation and there are NGO staff in the vehicle who go, okay, our procedures, our rules say we have to stop, we can't go along this road, we have to go in this direction, and the journalist goes, yes, but that's where the story is. How do we get there? So you have a conflict happening there, and if you've got the comms department going, oh yeah, we need the story, we need to support the journalist, it can create other problems. But there's also the less tangible ones. Within NGO security, we talk a lot about acceptance, our need to be accepted by the communities we work in, to be understood. We don't use armed protection. We don't use generally so much hard security measures, which means we are very reliant on how we're perceived. So if we're seen with a journalist and the journalist is publishing a certain story or is talking to opposition or government members, that can have an influence on who the community think we are as the NGO. So I know I've spoken to Michelle in the past about the sort of the transparency and accountability. You know, should the journalist be saying transport was provided by X NGO, which demonstrates the journalist's ethics, but what does that do to us and our security, and because of how the community see us? I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, a taste of some of the misunderstandings we got there. Siobhan.
So I am commission editor for current affairs at Channel 4, so I oversee a lot of Channel 4's foreign programming. I look after the series Unreported World, some dispatches and one-off documentaries. Before that, I was a filmmaker, making films mostly in the developing world. So I have made, over the years, just dozens and dozens and dozens of films that would not have been made had it not been for the relationships that I have with NGOs. And I would say transparency, the word that you were just mentioning there, is probably, the older I get and the more experienced I get, I think that transparency is the key to things not really coming massively unstuck in the field. I think journalists have to be really honest about what they are actually going to do as much as is humanly possible. And I think likewise NGOs have to be honest about realistically what they can actually provide. And I think that has to actually come from the people on the ground as well. They have to be in the loop whenever, because I think what often happens is that the head office in London or Geneva or wherever, of course we'd love to host you, yes, and have access. We'll have people who'll be able to show you around and show you all of our and then you get to the ground and there's 3 extraordinarily overworked local staff saying, where did you come from, and maybe next Tuesday. So I think transparency on both sides is really key, because it is difficult. It's absolutely, you cannot deny that we as journalists are imposing on local NGO workers whenever we're with them. We're a very, very demanding bunch. You're stopping people getting on with the work that they want to be getting on with, so it's something that does have to be negotiated very, very carefully and very honestly, and the friction does come there. But I thought that what I should probably do is show a clip of a television programme, seeing as how that's what we make, where just to remind everybody of how mutually beneficial this arrangement can be whenever you get it right, how it can really, really have an impact, and it can really change people's opinions of what's going on in a situation, and it can be beneficial to both sides. So this is a film called The Invisible People, which was on Unreported World in the last run, which definitely would not have been possible had it not been for the very, very tolerant Handicap International. In the last one, we also made a film with huge support from MSF in Sierra Leone on Ebola, and we rely on a lot of NGOs. This one is about disabled Syrian refugees who have fled into neighbouring Lebanon, and obviously the refugee situation there is bad as it is, but for the disabled it's the worst. And I thought I would just show you, just to remind us of what we can do together.
Today, I'm in the nearby city of Tripoli with the only charity that deals specifically with disabled people.
معك نديم من المنظمة الدولية للإعاقة.
The charity says 1 in 5 Syrian refugees has a disability.
نحن بدنا شيء تقريبا 10 دقايق بنكون عندكم.
Nadeem is a social worker who helps families get what help is available. Binan is a physiotherapist. Both are Lebanese. They are visiting Ahmed. He lost his legs after a rocket attack in Syria.
This brings back a lot of memories, but I had to say it's not.
He arrived in the country over 2 years ago, while there was still decent accommodation available, which the UN paid for.
Actually, we have almost identical injuries.
Despite his injuries, Ahmed has begun working as a volunteer with the UN, helping other disabled refugees.
لكن أنت بتعرف كثير ناس هون بحاجة مساعدة.
أنا بطبيعة عملي إنه بفتل عن المسؤولين كذا، يعني بيطلع معي حالات كذا، بحب أنا أوصلهم لكم تقدروا تساعدوني.
Every day, he travels out to visit people in the neighbourhood. On a bike, he adapted himself.
حطينا نحن ضفنا دولاب من هون ودولاب من الطرف الثاني مشان التوازن.
And this bit here?
هاي مشان شفتوا الغيار فتيس.
Okay, so the big question, can I have a go? Okay, so it's one bike, 2 men, no legs. What's the worst that could happen?
Well, listen.
When winter comes, it will bring storms and freezing temperatures. Aya's family are doing their best to get ready.
طب ليش ما عملت لي من ذاك الجنب؟ أنا ما بدي من هذا الجنب.
So is this getting ready for the winter?
هون في عنا كثير عواصف. على البحر عواصف كثير. بدنا نمكن. مشان شو ده كثير؟ مشان قد ما صار عواصف تضلها ثابته.
عشان ما نقعد بالليل ما نلاقيها. نلاقيها طايرة.
حطوا حجاره محمد، حطوا حجاره انت حواليها. اي حطها.
ليش ما حطيتها ورا؟
Every time I see her, Aya is like a shining light. She's always smiling. She must mean so much to all of you.
هي تحسسنا إنه بحياة حلوة قد من كان. حتى هن تشوفوا عزة بس هي قوية هي قوية بكل شيء يعني ما كان احتمال ولا نسبة 1% تعيش وعايشة.
في دكاترة عنا في سوريا عطوها مهلة إنه ما بتعيش لحد الشهرين. كتر الأدوية والعناية صار عمر 5 سنوات.
Do you think this is going to hold out against the winter?
ما بتزبط يعني بدنا تطير بدنا يعني نتعذب فيها.
شلون بقى نهاي الشتوي نحن اجينا ونحن بوجهنا وجه البحر اجباري نحن ما نطوف ونسبح بالمي.
بدنا نطوف بالمي.
How do you think Aya is going to cope with the winter?
خايفة آية في هالظروف هاي تسيبها شيء بالبرد وآية صعب عليها البرد يعني ولا احتمال انه تعيش 1% في البرد اذا ما كان عناية فيها بيت دفى. آية ما بتموت. آية بدها تعيش.
The UNHCR are now working to find Aya and her family better accommodation. No one here wants to be a refugee. They've escaped the war only to be caught up in another humanitarian tragedy. With Lebanon overwhelmed and the outside world failing to do enough, it's the most vulnerable refugees who endure the worst suffering.
That's it.
Okay.
Nothing more to say than that. No, I think that it was really that shoot was really difficult on the ground. You had to find a character like, I mean, everybody massively responded to Aya, right? Aya is just the most incredible character. You can't just walk in the first place you see, and so that really takes time, and there's friction, and I think it was a hard shoot, really hard shoot for both the journalists and the NGO. But at the end, we thought we'd really done our job very well, and we got a fantastic film out of it. Aya's family actually have been, I mean, you're trying to do it to raise the wider issue, but her family have been offered a huge amount of support as a result of the film going out. And Handicapped International, it's not why we're doing it to raise impact, but they saw a spike in donations whenever the film went out as well. So it ended up being, worth it, but it's not easy balancing those relationships.
Thanks. Polly, you've had some interesting projects recently. Yeah. Tell us.
I mean, I've come out actually this evening feeling relatively positive about things, which is maybe not exactly what you want to hear. I think that there's lots of things that go okay. And yeah, we've all got some difficult stories, but I think over the years, and I've been now head of comms here for 6 years, I think we've got better at it. And I think key is managing expectations. And I'm a comms person working in an NGO, and I think my role and that of my team is to bridge that expectation gap. So we know that the media really actually, the story that they want to tell, MSF or the project that the NGO is doing is only a very small part of it. So they're not really, and we were talking earlier about, journalists that come saying, we're really interested in your water project. Well, they're not, okay? And if they tell you they are, they're really pulling a fast one. They shouldn't be. I mean, your water project, fascinating though I'm sure it is, isn't that interesting. What's interesting is what's going on in the country, the wider political issues, and the suffering of the people is just a part of that. And so you really have to go in with your eyes wide open to how maybe the work of your teams into a wider story, and having understood that and had a really honest conversation with the journalist about, okay, what are you actually trying to do here? What's your story really about? Then transmitting that to the people in the field, because we've all got stories of where we've promised warm welcome and they get there with a door slammed in their face, and that can happen however good your communication is. But managing expectations is absolutely critical. Understanding you're only a small part, they're really not that interested in your project, and that it's just a piece of a larger story. And then also managing expectations with the journalists. So, being really honest and you mentioned, Siobhan, transparency, and I think that's really critical. So I would, that your organisation is perfect and that everything about your project is cheap, because that's not true. And however good your project is, there'll be flaws in it. And the best case scenario, you're only meeting a tiny proportion of the needs, and the worst case scenario, it's staffed by total psychos. And there's all kinds of things that are going to be going on the ground that the journalist is going to find out when they get there. So the very best thing you can do is be open and honest about how you're actually playing quite a small part in what's a bigger picture, and managing those expectations internally and with the journalists. And then, and this is scary, but then it has to kind of come down to trust. I hope that we get a chance to talk about different kinds of relationships you have with different kinds of journalists, but we've done quite a number of documentary projects recently, and we've had to trust them. We've had to give up the illusion of control and trust the broadcaster or the journalist to do a fair job. And And that's scary, but it really, I'm beginning to think increasingly it's actually the only way. So, manage expectations, try and understand where they're coming from. So if it's a documentary, they're going to need characters. And however much your head of mission wants to be the face of what you're doing, they're really dull. But that sparky nurse is fantastic, and so they're going to end up following him. So, that's just... you need to understand what they're looking for, and then help the team on the ground explain. I mean, there's lots of kind of practical issues that you need to sort out in advance. So we were talking about trips that journalists might make, leaving aside the documentary side of things. So, journalist is coming to visit you. How long are they going to stay? Are they expecting to stay in your house? Normally, we would really recommend to people not to, because our accommodation standard's not really great, and if it's a big emergency, everyone's sleeping on the floor, and they won't want to budge up and make room for you, and you won't get a very warm welcome. 100% recommend transport, because it's one thing if you want to go and visit a place that's in the north of the country and we happen to be driving up there, then okay, we can give you a lift. But if you're coming and you're planning to be around for a while, definitely get your own car and your own driver, because even if we happen to be going in the same direction, the fact is that you are, as a journalist, however much I think you're wonderful and top of my priority list, the team actually don't care very much about you, and you are definitely further down the priority list than the surgeon who needs to get into the hospital, and you are likely to spend a lot of time waiting around to be prioritized in your car movement. So get your own car, hire your own driver. Then when you get to the checkpoint and MSF's team say we're going no further, if you want to take that risk, you go further, you go. But that's your risk, and do tell us all about it when you come back. So, there are sort of practical issues about, managing expectations. If you are going to stay with us, bring something as a gift for the team. Cheese is generally really appreciated. Magazines, some countries booze is okay, some it's not. So, think about and nail those details down beforehand, because they can really cause kind of friction. So they're practical issues about managing expectations and thinking about things in advance, and are you going to need a translator and all of that. Generally, I would encourage people to be as autonomous as they can be, because honestly, you'll have and I think that's probably it. But I'm quite positive about it at the moment.
In the announcement, we saw the picture of the goggles with the goggle cam. Can you talk about that project, because that was quite extreme embedding in a sense?
Well, it wasn't really embedding at all. It was us producing content for Panorama. So the filming took place in September. So the Ebola epidemic was at its height. There were peaks in different places, different times, but it was certainly the situation was really grim. We were desperate for coverage. There were a couple of broadcasters who had sent teams out. Unreported World and Horizon both had managed to do a bit of filming, but the BBC were keen to do a panorama, but were not able, for reasons of their high-risk unit, to send somebody into the Ebola treatment centre themselves, and anyway, we had a rule at that point that we weren't going to allow any journalists in. So we had this kind of interesting meeting where we all agree that it'd be wonderful to make this programme, but we can't see how it's going to happen. But then I've got a guy who works in my team who has a documentary background. He actually does our video and multimedia for us, and they'd seen his CV and they said, well, he could do it. And then we said, yeah, I suppose he could actually. So in the end, my team went out and spent 5 weeks and filmed the whole thing. And he was the only cameraman on the ground. We had goggle cams that the production company, which is called Blakeway, which give credit to where credit's due, developed, and you could drop them in chlorine, because everything that goes into the high-risk zone has to either be burned or be dipped in chlorine. So they helped develop some specific filming material, but we filmed the whole thing. I think because of the trust that had to be there. So I mean, this is the BBC, and I'm a licence payer, and I want the BBC, as well as everyone else does, to have real independent editorial standards. And I'm not comfortable with them just taking NGO material and saying, hey, that's the situation. And they weren't either. And the whole discussion about the BBC went right to the top and back down again about were they comfortable to do this. In the deal we came to, and I felt good about it, both as a licence fee payer and as the head of comms, was that we had really no editorial control at all. And that they took every single bit of footage that we filmed, and there were no things deleted beforehand, and they could see by the time codes, and we gave them everything. And they made the edit. And we accepted that, okay, we had been there filming, but we were not making the film. And we got to see it once before it went out, because as the medical staff responsible for the care of, we felt we had a real responsibility to make sure people weren't exploited. And we had real concerns about the way that consent was given, because the people asking for consent were also members of the MSF team, and it wasn't like people had a choice to go to another Ebola centre if they didn't. And so we wanted to make sure that, we had a lot of just long discussions about consent. But yeah, in the end, we gave them everything, and they let us see it once. We made a couple of small changes to, I hope, protect the dignity a bit more, and then that was it, and then they put it out. So, and I think I feel proud of it. I mean, it was a hard watch. I actually brought a snippet of it for you guys here today, and I watched it before, and it made me cry at my desk. So we're not going to show it to you again. But it was a hard watch, but it was brutal, but it was very honest insight into what we had, and the contract that we had with the production company, and I kid you not, and there's probably someone somewhere is filming this and I'm going to get into trouble, but it was 2 sides of A4, and I never put it past a lawyer. We have internal MSF lawyers, really good legal department, and I didn't take them anyway.
They have no idea what's going on.
No, someone probably ought to tell them, but they're lovely people, but they have an issue. They want to protect our reputation. And if I take, and I've done a documentary in the past with a different company that had been a nightmare from start to finish, because we'd allowed our colleagues in operations and in the legal department to think that it was their film. And they thought that they were making a film, and they had editorial control, and the contract was 38 pages long, and it had all these different editorial things, and it was a nightmare from start to finish. And it ended up making and it was not the fault of the broadcasters at all, who were great, but we made a really rubbish film. We took all the interesting bits out because we were concerned about this, that, and the other. So with this time, we did it on trust, and 2 sides of A4, and we got to see it once, and yeah, I had a couple of sleepless nights. And if it had gone wrong, I'd have got sacked. But it was okay. And it was definitely the right thing to do, because there's an institutional, I want to say imperative, but instinct actually, to protect your brand, to protect your institution. And I'm the head of comms, and I should take this stuff really seriously, and I do, but I don't think our brand is best protected by sanitizing things to the point where they don't tell a good story, and we don't make good TV. So, yeah, that was how we did it.
Thank you. The example was particularly interesting to hear about. There's about 5 seats at the front, if anybody's getting tired at the back there. 5, possibly 6. So we can, I think, Millicent, go to the audience for some questions, comments, and then do a few of them and then bring it back to the panel. Sir.
Hi, before we move on to other stuff, can I just ask a couple of questions about what you were just talking about, Polly? You talked about before, your policy at the time wasn't to film inside a treatment unit. So did that...
Not to allow external people to film inside. So we'd filmed ourselves, and we'd released some B-roll for the world's media because there was a lot of demand, but we had a policy not to let any journalists inside.
And that remains because you were able to film. And you said you did all right. It was more than all right. It was amazing. And I followed it on Twitter, and it was later in the evening for lots of reasons, because it had such impact. But I'm very interested if you can share, because consent and dignity is at the heart of a lot of the difficulties between the NGO and the journalists. And comms people aren't always seen to be on the right side sometimes. And, we did see a child suffering with Ebola in that
That's the clip I brought.
And the child did
Die.
pass.
Yeah.
So these are things that I wouldn't have guessed would have made it into your film, and the fact it did, I think, was important. But I'd be really interested to know what you can share about the conversations that allowed that to happen.
So consent, we were really careful about consent. We got on-camera consent from every person with, and the production company were really careful afterwards to follow each person up and make sure that in every shot we had that person had given consent. The child that died, and his name was Alpha, I don't want to talk about him like he didn't have a name, so Alpha, the problem with Alpha, and he was a baby, I mean, he's only 11 months, his parents had already predeceased him. So there was no adult to give consent. And the way that the filming was done was with the goggle cams, everybody was filmed. And so, because the doctor had it attached to his goggles, so the consent then came not to be filmed, but whether we used that footage. So we otherwise only used footage of people we had no consent. And it did prompt a lot of conversations within MSF and with the Blakeway and with the BBC. And I took advice from friends of mine who work at Channel 4 and who were not involved in the programme, but is it okay to show a child suffering like that who you haven't got consent for? And I don't think there was a right or wrong answer. I mean, there isn't like an algorithm that you can put this stuff into. No further harm could befall him. It went as badly wrong for him as it could do. And I felt quite strongly, and I know that the doctor who really cared about him did as well, that otherwise his life and his death went unmarked completely. And that wasn't okay. And what happened to Alpha happened to a lot of people. And somehow there was an imperative to share that with the public. And I'll definitely post the watershed. And even my husband found something pressing that needed to be done in the kitchen around that time, because it was a very hard watch. But it was important, and I didn't want it to go unnoticed. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sir? Maybe when you ask, you could maybe identify a little bit whether you're an NGO or a journalist or another gender entirely.
Yeah, Mark Galloway from the International Broadcasting Trust. I was a journalist, now I'm from an NGO, so I've seen this from both sides. I want to pick up on the issue of transparency, which several people have mentioned, because in some ways, the two films we're talking about, The Panorama and The Unreported World, were just standout, exceptional pieces that concentrated on the human drama and the story. And it was very difficult, but things go less wrong when it's about human stories. I think there's a whole problem area that we haven't really touched on, which is the NGO, the status of the NGO, the reputation of the NGO. Journalists have become mistrustful of NGOs. NGOs' instinct is to be defensive, not open. So the way you're talking, Polly, is exceptional. There isn't going to be a head of comms at Save the Children or somewhere else who would talk like that. And I think it's a huge challenge. There may be. We might hear from Save in a moment.
Now you started something.
We've actually just produced a report, which I sent you earlier today, Ben, the aid industry, what journalists really think, because we wanted to say to NGOs, look, you're out of touch with what journalists really think and what their agenda is. And that was a difficult read. It was quite shocking to see how negative journalists were about NGOs, saying they become corporate, they weren't open, and one or two NGOs operated in a different way, one of which was MSF, and Handicap International isn't a big corporate NGO in the way that some of the others are. And ironically, one of the other criticisms journalists had of NGOs was that NGOs were too close to journalists.
Maybe Siobhan, do you have a list of corporate and non-corporate NGOs?
No, I'm just interested, Mark, who were you, who was giving you that feedback? Because I think there is quite a gulf between, when you refer to journalists, obviously, I mean, there are freelancers who are going out to try and find a story to come back and sell it, who don't necessarily have the budgets behind them to do it themselves, who are going to be really much more easy to manipulate in a way. You know, there's a bargaining that can go on there. And also from a security point of view, actually, are totally reliant on the NGO to guarantee their security in a way. So that's on the freelance side. You know, something like the BBC, or if it's BBC staff, or in our case, we work with only with freelancers, or mostly with freelancers, but they're within our security envelope and budgeting and all the rest of it. So they're very, very, very different experiences, I think, of journalists. I think it's much easier to try and extract a quid pro quo from a very junior freelancer who's totally reliant on you than it might be from a big media organisation to an extent.
Did you have something else? Did
we talked to a range of journalists.
Yeah, I'm sure you did, yeah.
From Channel 4, BBC, Daily Mail, online journalists. And there was a kind of consensus. Admittedly, the person from Channel 4 News was probably the most positive in terms of their attitude to NGOs. But it was quite surprising that, and I think there's this underrunning current that may grow and become bigger, particularly as we're in the age of kind of social media and openness.
And what was their main beef? Was it control primarily? That the NGO was trying to control their output.
To control the message. They don't get exactly what Polly said, that journalists have their own agenda and stories to tell.
Yeah.
That they're dealing with journalists as if they're doing corporate PR.
I mean, I think it's difficult to say, because I do think that the longer the relationship that you have with an NGO, obviously, the easier it gets. It's based entirely around trust, and then it gets a lot easier. I think when your first ever interaction between an organisation or a journalist and an NGO, then it can, for sure, there's a bit of a battle for the agenda, definitely.
Lisa?
I think one of the other issues as well is we talk about NGOs as if there's some consistency, and every NGO is different. And I think the other thing that comes to my mind as an ex sort of field staff is there's also that disconnect between the comms team, who the journalists might speak to at headquarters, and the field staff. And I remember, it's a few years ago now, but getting very mixed messages from headquarters. There's a journalist in the area, support them, provide them everything you need, or everything they need, but don't open your mouth because you don't want the journalist to misinterpret what you say. So you don't really know how to behave. And I think it would be interesting to know who the journalists are referring to, because I think they'll get very different messages from the sort of the comms team and the people on the ground who are actually sort of trying to do the programmes.
The other thing, I don't know if this was feedback that you got whenever you were talking to people, but one thing that I think does leaves journalists a little bit gobsmacked sometimes, and I know that everybody is competing for finite resources, but it can sometimes be the reaction of NGOs who are interested in a conversation with you until you let them know that you're also talking to a different NGO who just happens to be in the same country, and sometimes that can be problematic for sure. That can shut down conversation pretty quickly, I think.
Michelle?
Yeah, I just want to throw another perspective into this. Most of the work that I do now is with local journalists. So when I was in the Central African Republic, I was working with Central African journalists. And there was a real disconnect between the local journalists and the aid agencies. Yet the aid agencies were supposedly there to help these guys, to feed them, to get sanitation, water, health, etc., etc. They didn't know where to go to get clean water. They didn't know where their nearest, medical clinic was. They didn't know where they could get seed so that maybe they could grow some crops before the rains came. So there was a real disconnect, and they simply didn't have access, and there was real frustration. And on the other side, the NGOs also wanted coverage, but the only journalists they would speak to were the international journalists. So there was some real frustrations there, and we tried to bridge that a little bit. Unfortunately, we ran out of funding and weren't able to continue that project. So that's one issue. And on the other side, also the journalists are very aware that there was, for all these various NGOs, there is some kind of comms team there. In other words, they have money. So why are they not working with us? Why are they not, maybe they could even pay for us to, to run a spot or something. So there's a lot of different issues, I think, that need to be acknowledged that are going on in the field with local journalists and the field staff.
Floor is open.
Hi, I think
full disclosure, I work with Heba. Transparency and all.
I feel we've been very hard on, and I'm just wondering if we could talk a bit about the responsibility of the journalists. And in a case like your film, you said that Handicap's funding went up after the film. By choosing to do what you did, obviously you are bringing one NGO up and by default keeping the others down in terms of visibility and so on. So I think the editorial decisions that we make about who to highlight and who not to highlight, I don't know how seriously we think about those things when we go on these trips, knowing that we are going to be giving exposure to one and not the others.
Yeah.
And then also, had you come across in that piece negative aspects of their work, how would you have fit that in? It would have been difficult for you to fit that into the story. So your reflections maybe from you guys on that side of things.
I mean, we've worked with dozens and dozens of NGOs. Some of them are, big international organisations like MSF. Very often we work with very, very small grassroots NGOs in country rather than big international organisations. So I think that we show the work of a really broad range of organisations. I mean, the film, obviously, what we were setting out to do was not an investigation into HI. It was very much, we were, it's the big challenge for all of us last year, and looks like this year is how you tell the Syrian story, given the limitations of reporting on it, with sending people inside. And so a lot of the work you do is around the borders, and that's was a real priority for us last year. So we wanted to tell a story about Syria, and this was the story that we went to tell. If we had come across some, a big issue of neglect or corruption, then the story might have had to change. You do have a duty to tell the truth about what you find there. But yeah, thankfully we didn't. I mean, it's actually that film was one of the issues that we had in that film is a very common issue that happens an awful lot with NGOs is, our job as journalists on the ground, and particularly whenever you're filming things, is to get testimony, is to hear from people about the worst experience in their life. That's very often the case. And so what you are effectively doing is you're sitting in front of somebody and saying, please can you revisit the worst experience of your life, and I'm going to film it. That inevitably is a very distressing experience for the subject. It's very often an incredibly distressing experience for my teams, and the teams, sometimes are terribly emotionally affected by it. But it's if you want a film that is going to make impact, that is what your job is. Now, obviously, you have to have judgment as to how far you push that, and if people are distressed, you can't sit and watch people, breaking down, sobbing, and not. It's a very, you want to console them, you want to. So there's a real balance with that. But I think for NGO staff, and especially I think often for local staff, that they can get really, really. Why are you asking those questions? Why would you want to take that person back to that place? And I think that is goes to the absolute core of some of the friction between NGOs. And I don't know if you think about that with MSF, but that's a real judgment call that you need really sensitive journalists that don't push it too far. But also, NGO staff on the ground have to understand that if a television crew is coming to interview somebody about their experience, they are going to ask for that person to tell their story. So I think there can be, that can be a cause of, real problems.
Possibly add? And I think sort of adding to that as well, and often what gets forgotten is that the NGO, the field staff are continuing long after the comms team and the journalist and the media circus has been and gone. And I think that's where we sometimes start thinking about some of the security consequences, because what has been raised during this, has this brought to the fore issues that the community had perhaps put aside and that might bring more risks to the organisations, or perhaps other organisations who are working within the vicinity, because it's not always easy for the community to say, oh, well, you were filming Handicap International, but maybe the community can't distinguish between the different NGOs, and there can be consequences which sort of we sometimes don't think about when we're actually looking at the output that we're looking for at the time.
I mean, we at Channel 4, we have there's one or two people here who have had the misfortune to go through them. Very laborious, security and risk protocols that talk about immediate and present danger, but also talk about all of those issues and contribute. I mean, there's no point thinking about it once you're there. You absolutely, in a boring, organised way, have to have all these conversations before you go.
I think if I can just come in, when I talked about managing expectations, that's really a big part of it. So, we're not a organisation that parachutes in, takes really shocking testimony and then leaves again. We want to stay on the ground, and so before we even talk about you going and visiting us, you've got to understand that there'll be things that you will see and that we will say to you quietly and privately that we don't want attributed to us, because we want to stay. And I know we have a reputation as an organisation being really outspoken. Well, it does not mean that we say everything we think and see, not at all. And ultimately, a medical organisation, we want to stay on the ground, and there are entire programs that we've facilitated that don't have any mention of us in at all, because we don't want MSF attached to this story, but we want the story told. And you need to have those discussions with the teams really, with the journalists really early on, and make them understand why that is. And then the other thing I wanted to say, because I think it's something that comes up comes as a problem often, is you have these, not so much with documentaries, but certainly with news reports, is that you build a relationship with a journalist, either the field team or the person that you sent out, and they write, a carefully, insightful article, or they do a great bit of, filming, which you think has really just totally hit the nail. It's got some great shots of your organisation doing what it is you do that your donors excited to see on the news, but then the person that you've built that relationship with, that journalist, they're not the one doing the edit, and that's really important to remember, so you don't feel so betrayed when your logo isn't in at the end, or when they've got an actually really nice article but a hideous headline, and they didn't write the headline. So, and you need to remind your colleagues when they're freaking out that actually that journalist hasn't totally sharp. Didn't write the headline, they didn't do the final edit. It's a process with a number of people, and sometimes you do end up feeling a bit let down because you have put quite a lot of effort in, and and you didn't get the shot of your person doing the thing that would have been really brilliant on the 10 o'clock news. But that's just the way it crumbles sometimes.
Just one really quick point here, and I think it's been alluded to, but just to state it really, really clearly, there needs to be a really clear discussion at the outset of any kind of partnership between a news organization and an NGO before you get into this stuff. And ideally, there will be a terms of partnership in writing that covers issues to do with safety and security, that has to do with liability issues, who covers transport, who covers housing, all that kind of stuff. Whether the NGO wants to see a final edit before it goes to air, all of that stuff needs to be down before anything else happens.
Hi, Nazanin Mashiri from Al Jazeera English. Just a couple of points and possibly a question for MSF. I've had varying experiences with MSF in Kenya, probably quite some bad experiences. In Central Africa, excellent experiences. But talking about transparency and how close journalists get to NGOs and organisations, just give you an example. This is probably an extreme example, but it does happen sometimes. Our team discovered a massacre in Western Central African Republic, and in the process of discovering that, some of the survivors were in an MSF hospital. So clearly, before we aired the programme, we had to talk to the head of mission. We had to get these people out to a safe location, to another hospital, away from this hospital. And we had to liaise with MSF, who were extremely helpful. We managed to help these people move them, and also get extra protection at the hospital as well from the African Union forces, because it was still under the control of Seleka rebels at that point. So obviously we were very with MSF and very clear with them what we were doing, and we had to be for that reason. But I do feel uncomfortable sometimes talking about, transparency, because there are some situations or some stories whereby you cannot be completely transparent with NGOs. You can't tell them everything, because you don't know who they're going to be telling. They have local staff, and sometimes it is difficult to balance that out. And I don't know if NGOs quite understand that the difficulty that we have as journalists. And one more point I want to make is that I have seen some journalists get very, very close to particular NGOs. They do seem to favoritise sometimes journalists from Channel 4 News, for example. They get access where nobody else gets access. They get stories before everyone else. They get taken to places where other journalists, freelance journalists, and even journalists from CNN or Al Jazeera can only dream about. And you kind of think, okay, well, Channel 4 News, 80,000 viewers, maybe. Al Jazeera, 250 million homes. CNN, 500 million homes. And you kind of wonder what's going through that NGO's head and why you can't just give access to,
Okay. Shall I
more
answer
journalists.
that?
Yeah, so quite a few questions there, sorry.
I'm really
I'm a frustrated journalist here, so.
I'm kind of curious about what went wrong in Kenya, so we'll talk about that afterwards. But, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we don't favoritise Channel 4, but to be fair to them, Channel 4 News rather than documentaries, they show interest where others don't. And, so for an example, there was a couple of years ago a big refugee crisis of people coming from Sudan, North Sudan, across into an area around Maban. And it was thoroughly, the situation was appalling. And it was so devastated and destitute an area that we were flying in eggs. There was nothing there, and there were hundreds of thousands of people, and it was really grim. And we also see difficult and horrible situations around the world, but this was an acutely awful one. And we worked hard to get anybody interested. And we did call CNN, and we did call Al Jazeera, and they were not interested. Actually, to be fair, Al Jazeera did go later and are generally also another one of those organisations that is interested in foreign stories and is good at covering those neglected crises that we've got a great stack of. But Channel 4 were the ones who said, yeah, okay, that sounds interesting. How do we get there? And we were really grateful that they showed any interest at all, because no one else had. And they went and they did some amazing filming, and it wasn't just with us. And they filmed with WFP and with the UN, who were there as well. But we twisted their arms. We'd begged them to go. The same as we did with Central African Republic. Interestingly, Central African Republic, we begged Channel 4 to go, and they went. In the end, they went to Save the Children, but they also visited with us as well. And we'd tried so hard to get them there. We'd promised them a warm welcome, and they got there, and the people on the ground were foul to them, and slammed the door in their face. I had to take Alex Thompson out for a beer afterwards, but really apologise. But it was just unlucky, overworked team, feeling really stressed. Probably the third filming crew. They had 2 French crews the day before, and they were just sick of it. And it was just unlucky and unfortunate. And sometimes, however good your scene setting is beforehand, you just get some grumpy sod in the field. And does, years of good relationship building. Yeah, I think we're probably the recognition there. But I mean, we don't favouritize Channel 4, but we appreciate Channel 4 News's dedication, as with Al Jazeera, to covering stories that other people aren't interested in. And the budget thing is really, like, we've alluded to it, and we've talked a little bit about the freelancers and poor freelancers, but like even the big news broadcasters have really tight budgets, and you have a difficult year where there's a lot of crises. By April they've run out of money for foreign stories, and it's really hard to persuade them that that's a story worth investing in. And these African things are expensive, flying from Nairobi to Central African Republic, and you have to go to Dakar first and then come back again, and it costs thousands of pounds, and what are we going to see when we get there, and is really anyone interested? And it's hard to get people interested. And we don't pay for journalists, so they have to stump up.
But
And
they do bring chocolates and magazines.
They do bring chocolates and cheese, critically cheese. And sometimes, we were talking about downstairs, like we've got a journalist from a major outlet, who is wants to visit one of our projects and actually that is a story that's about us, not a story about the situation. A little bit different from what I was saying earlier. So it is a story where, we're the front and centre of it. And he said, we don't have any money for it. Can you pay my flight? I said, no, we don't pay your flight, but we did put you in touch with the airline, and if you mention them nicely, they'll pay your flight. So, so we do try, but the budget cutting and the reliance on cheap ways of telling stories is a problem. And then the other thing, sorry, I've got so many notes, is that there's this kind of weird breed of, they're lovely people, most of them, of foreign correspondents who are not really formally attached to a news outlet in the way that they're having a salary paid all the time. So they're not the correspondent, but they're a kind of stringer. So they regularly write for this paper, or they regularly, feed in stories to this outlet. And they're in an area, and they're living this kind of hand-to-mouth existence where they're trying to pay the bills with a combination of work for NGOs, so I'll shoot your next, Mother's Day campaign, and work for broadcast outlets or newspapers. And this, brings you into this kind of world where, you can, they're like, guns for hire, almost, pens for hire, and you can hire them to visit your project, and then if you're lucky and you talk to them nicely, they'll also pitch that same story as an independent journalist into their news outlet, and that happens a lot.
I have to say, I think that it's very wrong for journalists to travel in NGO vehicles. I think that's a big no-no, especially for Al Jazeera. We'd never do that. We always have our own vehicles. I know it's expensive.
I think you're quite right.
I think it's extremely wrong. And I think journalists have to be very aware. You are putting that organisation at risk, because you will be speaking to groups that they will get angry about. And whoever's in charge or whoever's controlling the area will not like you. So you are putting them at risk. And we avoid that totally. But just the transparency thing, it's very difficult, isn't it, sometimes, to be totally transparent with NGOs about exactly what you're doing and what you're covering. It's not always possible.
Genuinely, whenever I was going to actually go back to, because I'm not sure exactly how many situations I find where that is the case. I think if you're trying to use an NGO in order to get in to tell a different story, then obviously, but we haven't actually, I don't know that I can think that many cases where it has been really difficult for us to tell an NGO what we've been doing, honestly. I don't look after Channel 4 News on a day-to-day basis. I look after Channel 4 long-form documentaries and current affairs.
But what if you're doing an investigation into that NGO?
Oh, well, yeah, obviously. Then, yeah.
Or you're doing an investigation into, for example, in Somalia, you're doing an investigation into, which I did, into food agencies and food getting onto the black market.
Yes. Well,
so that's an extreme example, but there are examples like that.
Obviously, because we did Jamal
well, then,
obviously
did that story.
There's no transparency. If you've got a public interest investigation into an NGO, then you should do that investigation and go to the NGO afterwards with a right of reply, of course. I mean, that's I was just trying to think but absolutely. I mean, we've done investigations in NGOs over the years where that's been the case, yeah.
And also there is a danger when you're spending a lot of time with one particular NGO, like Save the Children, for example, in Central African Republic, that has a high profile in the UK, but does not have a high profile in Central African Republic at all, really. When you go out to the different projects, you're highlighting Save the Children, but there will be a frustration with other NGOs. They're not getting any publicity at all. I mean, does that bother NGOs?
I can live with that. It doesn't keep me awake at night at all. I think, good for Save. And it depends what story you're trying to tell. I mean, if you're telling a story about, saving the children, then probably they're the right people to go with. Right? Maybe they're running a clinic in the town that you wanted to visit, and that's fine.
Or maybe you shouldn't go to see a foreign NGO to begin with.
Yeah, or that's just a part of what's going on. Yeah, so you go and you see that, but then you go and see all the other things that Al Jazeera is going to see as well. I mean, you guys, more than anyone else, are not really reliant on, Western NGOs to tell the story.
Sorry, can I just say, I think that last point you were saying about, NGOs seeming to favour one news organisation. I think we see it the other way around, with news organisations favouring particular NGOs. And what we're talking about, the MSF Al Jazeera Channel 4 level, that's a tiny proportion, again, of the journalists that are out there in the media and the NGOs. And I think it's such a broad spectrum that we have to be quite careful about generalising, but some sort of basic rules around transparency and thinking about that is really important.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why we feel it's very important, we try very much, as I mentioned this earlier, but to us it's very important that we highlight very small grassroots NGOs, and that it doesn't always appear like the Europeans riding to the rescue, and that actually in a lot of the countries that we visit, there's tiny NGOs campaigning for mental health or disability rights or whatever. Try to mix it up so that there's not, because those people are doing an overwhelming amount of work on the ground in those countries. So I think it, on something on Report the World, if we only dealt with 3 international NGOs, it would be really remiss. Yeah.
I think we have a contribution here.
We've heard about the conflicts between journalists in the field with NGOs. Do you think that it would help to send out kind of dedicated comms staff to help smooth things over, or does that pose other problems?
So we do. Sometimes lots of the countries where we work have somebody who works, whose remit includes communications, whether they have comms in their title, or humanitarian affairs officer, or deputy head of mission, or something, or information and education officer. I mean, there'll be someone often in a country who's kind of responsible for dealing with media, local media, if not international. And then sometimes, if like the Danish office want to send, the Danish radio, they might go with them. If they can persuade the team to accept of 2 people rather than just one coming, they might go with them. And I've done that in the past, and I've encouraged my team to go as well, not to act as minders so much, but definitely facilitators, to be that person that tries to explain that it is actually really important that the journalist gets to the hospital as well, because, and could they please just stay a little bit later so we can finish that interview, and to kind of advocate for the journalist, give them a bit of space, be their advocate in the. Sometimes we send people out, and I've done that too. I was thinking about this actually. Taken some very high-profile sort of prima donna would be maybe unkind, but high maintenance journalists to MSF field projects, and it's been interesting. Not celebrities, but journalists who maybe think of themselves as celebrities, and one moment that just stuck in my mind forever, getting in the car and the local driver who was, not on a fortune, no one gets rich working for himself, and he said, put your seatbelts on, because, part of our security protocol, no one goes anywhere without seatbelt on, and the journalist refused to put his seatbelt on, and the driver, bless him, just refused to move until we had this kind of standoff with, ego clashes with security protocol, and then sheepishly put his seatbelt on, and we didn't speak about that anymore. Yeah, we do sometimes send comms people out, or we find somebody in the team who will take responsibility. So maybe the project coordinator, and please, can you look after this person and take responsibility for them? Yeah, that definitely helps.
Possibly have a countering view. I think there's definitely can help in terms of the workload, and you may not annoy the team in the field as much if somebody's taking care of the day-to-day needs of the journalist. But if that comms person is not actually any more au fait with the country than the journalist, they may be as big a security risk for the team as the journalist is. And there are examples from members where the comms person has, with the media, the journalist there, gone, yeah, of course we can take an armed escort, that's no problem. And then they're just about to set off and somebody in the programme's going, hang on a minute, that's completely against our protocol, you can't do that. So it can help in terms of logistics, but it's equally important that they do understand what they are getting themselves into, and they still also must abide by organisational rules. Another example I came across was the comms guy obviously wanted to get maximum publicity or information from the trip. We got him going to a Pakistan IDP camp. It wasn't legal, should we say, but it was known that people were doing it. And we discovered he was writing a blog telling people before we left that that was where we were going to be. And you don't want to do this in Pakistan. This bunch of internationals is about to go into the middle of nowhere. So, two-edged sword.
George, this coziness that Nazanin was talking about with, and this sort of inside the sausage factory deal making, is that part of the trust problem in your survey? It is George, isn't it? Sorry. Mark. Sorry, Mark. That trust is... Sorry, you're... yeah, Mark. No, this trust, if there are deals being made, there are understandings, there are relationships, and there are quid pro quos. I think we've portrayed a very happy situation here, and I'm sure if only a few of you could come out with your horror stories, it would be different. But is this a trust issue? There's too much backroom deal making?
No, that didn't particularly come up. It was more the bigger picture. I think what I was trying to address really was what is the role of the NGO, what is the voice that the NGO has, rather than the nitty-gritty of telling stories on the ground. What's the bigger picture? How does the NGO get its message across? How can NGOs be less defensive in the face of criticism? There's all this criticism coming at us. And I was thinking about issues like pay of CEOs of NGOs. We always get very defensive. How can we be more confident, more proactive, and more open in our dealings? And we're in a kind of new era where NGOs used to take for granted that journalists trusted them, that the NGOs are the good guys, and now we're not the bankers yet, but we're more open to scrutiny than sometimes we like to be.
It's not just journalists, though. I think it's the general public as well. And if you look at some of the social media conversations that you see on charities' Facebook pages and things, and people are asking searching questions, and frankly, they're just not buying the bullshit, and that's good. Because we're not perfect. There isn't, MSF isn't, for sure we're not, and frankly your NGOs aren't either. And we're a group of people trying to do the right thing in difficult circumstances, and sometimes getting it right, and sometimes not. And if you try and portray yourself as impeccable, then you will fail, and people will have pot shots at you and enjoy doing it because you've stuck yourself up on a pedestal. And frankly, a pedestal is a very dangerous place to stand, and I'm not going to put us up there. Right, and that's my final quote for the evening.
Yeah, okay.
Where people are getting their knowledge from NGOs is through the media and journalism.
It's not but it's not just anymore. So now you put out something that isn't true, and local people who also have social media accounts, and it depends, I mean, less so in Central African Republic, but definitely in Kenya, will go, that's not true. Here, look, here's the mother of that orphan, that you've purported as, and this stuff is, you're getting called on this stuff, and that's good. It holds us all to higher standards.
Do we need the media do this? Is there like a ranking of media outlets and below which you just don't bother taking the call?
Yeah, the locals, forget it.
Depends how busy you are at the time. There were times in last year when things were really crazy and we were literally ringing phones at each other where, you have to triage would be a good medical term for it. Who gets the call back first, and then if you've got time at the end of the day, I'll call that smaller one. Yeah, of course.
Does MSF really do it differently? I'm sure there's some other NGO press officers here who are thinking, no, they're just lucky, or they do this shtick about, warts and all, and they're just better at it than we are. I don't know.
I don't think we're
MSF
special.
different?
There's the one at the back. Sure, we're not.
So I guess it's part of the trust thing that we're mentioning, but it's the other way around. And we've all talked about the story, but there's actually often a discrepancy between what the media's idea of the story is and the NGO's on the ground's idea of the story, and perhaps a disconnect and a mistrust of the journalists that are trying to tell what is the real story happening on the ground. And the longer that you have a relationship with the media outlet, the more they will trust you that you're providing them with a story that is much bigger than that organisation or that response. And then that's how you generate this sort of relationship like MSF and Channel 4. So I do think but this is what we're referencing, isn't it? I'm not accusing you of having such a relationship.
But it's good.
It's the first time I've
As
met
an
Polly
example.
this evening. You wouldn't have thought it, would you? Shotgun
You know what
wedding.
I meant. So I guess I'm putting out there that perhaps this is changing, and I'm humanitarian comms of a charity that's been referenced quite a lot tonight, perhaps not positively. And I was working in Liberia for the Ebola response, and I hosted a number of media visits, a lot of which I facilitated a visit to IMC. It was never just about us, MSF as well, because I recognise, and I think all of my team do, that it's about the bigger picture and it isn't just about your organisation. But I just wonder whether journalists trust that we're there yet and trust us to be telling the bigger picture and not just our own story.
If I can just kind of take a stab at that, I think we as journalists need to be more skeptical as well, and I think we need to ask the tough questions as well, and we need to go in there. We usually do go in there with a certain idea of this is what we think the story is. Now that may change on the ground, but I'm not going to let Polly say, well, this is the story. Here's this great story. I might listen to her for a few seconds, but if I don't think that that's kind of where I want to go, I'm going to keep going where I want. So I think it's up to the journalist, and I think this is where we get into trouble a lot of times with and to the younger freelancers in the audience, but where we do get into trouble sometimes with younger freelancers who are so hungry and are just really want to get that story, and they will do anything to tell that story, including sitting down with Polly for 3 hours going, oh yeah, this is great. Yeah, let's see the water project is doing. So, I think there does need to be a huge level of skepticism as well for journalists in the field.
Siobhan, you want to react to
No,
that?
it was just a lovely sentiment there that we're all in it for the bigger picture and recognising each other's efforts and so on. It's not always something, I mentioned it earlier, is not always something that I recognise between NGOs, I would have to say. You do get people being a bit naughty and being a bit negative about their competitors, and journalists are absolute hypocrites. We're allowed to compete like hell, but not NGOs aren't allowed to at all. So, but yeah, that is something that you get quite a lot of on the ground, I think.
Tell us a bad pitch from an NGO.
A bad pitch from an NGO.
So they ring you and say, we've got this water project.
A bad pitch.
I've got the most amazing latrine.
Pitch from an NGO.
If I came to you and said,
with Jeremy
disabled
Clarkson
people,
in it? Going anywhere near any normal people? I don't know. I mean, it can't be.
I mean, there's a triage in the other direction.
Yeah, of course, because what our priority has to be is telling stories, and particularly in long form, telling stories that sustain either half an hour or an hour. So, you know, that digging the well may not quite make it there for the whole 60 minutes. You know, you do. It's probably underestimate just how much material you need for a long form documentary. I would say is probably one of the, you know, people will often pitch something that is a news story as a full length documentary. I would say.
Okay, a couple of minutes left. Anybody?
Yep.
Yes.
Hi, this is Joe Sonner-Clark from The Guardian. I was just wondering what the panel thought about the kind of in-house reporting that's kind of going on with the likes of Human Rights Watch and those other kind of institutions and Greenpeace to a lesser extent, who are kind of creating these, creating their own news organisations and doing their own reports, and what they think that challenges that poses in terms of objectivity and that kind of thing.
Well, I suppose.
Well, I think it's really boring, isn't it, to come back to the word transparency all the time. But I think, you know, it's about labelling, isn't it? And it's about being very, very, very clear who has made that material and where it's come from and what its purpose is. I think if you're really transparent with an audience, then it's a very different thing from putting things out and trying to get the mainstream media to pick them up whenever they haven't actually done any checking or investigation of their own. I think then that becomes problematic. Yeah.
Can you cut out the media now, Polly?
We do produce a lot of content. We do produce a lot of content. You know, there are multiple platforms, you know, in-house, you know, websites, news organisations. Also, I mean, there's a lot of space out there to be filled, and we do create our own content. I mean, I'm longer in the tooth than you are, and remember the Brent Spar thing and the reaction that the media had, and this is now 20 years ago, after, does anyone else here remember Brent Spar? So there was a time when Greenpeace had a lot of coverage from just their point of view on an issue, and then, you know, in retrospect, with hindsight, the media felt a little bit embarrassed that they just swallowed an NGO's communications and single point of view on an issue that actually turned out to be more complicated. And after that, there was a real kind of nervousness, I noted, and I was quite young in my career then, about using NGO content and a you know, scrupulousness about labelling it. So if they used an NGO footage, it would be labelled. And my experience is that has diminished in the last few years. And it's diminished in part because of pressures of time, I think, and because there's just so many, so many different packages that have to be done, you know, rolling news, website, web clips, and all of these. And so quite often, you know, the original source of a piece of footage is disconnected. And that can be because it's been washed through a Reuters feed, and it's a B-roll. And actually, we do quite a lot of B-roll, and we've got much better at it. And what we've discovered with B-roll is you don't want your organisational logo anywhere near it, because you know, it needs to sort of tell the story and have the footage that the broadcasters need. And we're providing a service to them. So if then, even if they don't use it that day, then a story about car, then okay, they can look back in their archives, and actually we sent them a whole thing about, you know, a whole load of footage and general shots and whatever on car a month previously. And we're giving journalists access direct to our media database. And they can download that stuff if they want to.
But I think having access to that B-roll is a completely different issue than what we're seeing from Human Rights Watch, for example. I mean, they are producing some really slick, fantastic stuff. And, you know, I don't want to say you get suckered in, but it's really, really good. It's really good. And I mean, this is a fairly educated audience right here. We know that this is Human Rights Watch that we're watching. We know, you know, we know what their agenda is. We know what they're trying to do. But the reality is, when it gets out there by any, you know, and wherever whether it's on Facebook, social media, whatever, not everybody's going to realize, well, this is not a news piece. This is an advocacy piece put out by Human Rights Watch. And I think that's where the lines are really, really, really getting blurred. And I think you're there. And not so much for the journalists, but I think for the general public.
Citizen journalism, advocacy journalism. Is it all one big
Coney
blob?
2012. I mean, it has its pitfalls. It can do. People need to know if there is something, an investigation in particular, I think, or a news story. I really think people need to know where that has come from and the sources, and that it has been thoroughly checked. I do. I think people still want that. If you're talking about pretties and GVs and general shots of an area, then I think that's different. People do share that an awful lot more online.
So we're nearly done. So Lisa, final thoughts?
It's been very interesting to me to listen to some of the journalists' perspective. As I say, when I was in the field, I was taught to be scared of journalists. And I think it's interesting to see that's from the other way around, but perhaps that's why we give a defensive position, particularly when you're in the field, if you don't have the support of a good comms department behind you. But I think from our perspective towards the journalists is recognising that we have to keep our programmes open for much longer than the story is running. And I think Polly mentioned those forgotten conflicts and forgotten. And for us to be able to keep those going, we need to make sure that any of the stories don't have an impact on us. And sometimes it's difficult to understand the consequences to us that other stories might have.
Michelle, final words of wisdom.
Wow. I'm not even sure where. I mean, there's been so much that's been said. I think we need to really hang on a few things. I think we need to hang on this idea of transparency vis-a-vis the NGOs, but also transparency for the journalists. But we also need to remember that there are levels of transparency. That if I'm doing an investigative piece on MSF, I'm probably not going to be as forthcoming and forthright, but I still would be transparent in the sense that, hey, I'm doing a story on MSF. Or I'm doing a story about this water project that MSF is doing in Liberia. Okay, so there are levels of transparency, I think. And I think everybody involved in this needs to understand that is what's going on, is that there are different levels. And just like there are different levels of journalists out there that are covering these stories, and there are different levels and different types of NGOs, whether local NGOs, international NGOs, big NGOs like MSF, so everything is there are different levels, different variances of just about everything that we're talking about tonight. I think we need to bear that in mind.
Polly?
I don't think I'm going to get any better than my pedestal comment.
Siobhan, over to you.
For journalists, I would say have the really difficult conversations before you go. It's really easy as journalists to go, I'll just get there and I'll sort it all out and it'll all be fine. It won't. It'll just get worse and you'll and everybody will be pissed off. So have the really difficult conversations before you go. And when you're there, be respectful and don't screw it up for the people that have to come after you.
Thank you very much for coming, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.